Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoria. So I'm just sitting here in my study contemplating medieval warfare, as you often do, and I don't always sit here in a helmet, incidentally. I do have this for a reason that will become apparent in a second, and I'm looking at a lot of medieval art at the moment for numerous reasons related to some equipment that I'm putting together, which I won't go into that because that's a tangent to what I want to talk about here, but what is something that is really overwhelming, actually going back, spending actually probably a few years, I've been away from researching medieval topics, which used to be my focus. As you know, focusing more on 19th century things in recent years. And coming back to the medieval scene, as it were, I have been reminded of, or even I've had certain things appear to me more starkly than they appeared before, because sometimes to step away from a topic gives you a better perspective when you come back to it. And one of the things that's really overwhelming when we look at the sources is how, by and large, unimportant swords are on the medieval battlefield. Now, I know some people are going to get quite butthurt and have a rage about that, but in HEMA, we focus so much on swords, and we focus so much on what the Germans would call Blossfechten, in other words, unarmoured fighting. But at the same time, lots of people doing HEMA, whether they're doing longsword, messer, or whatever, side sword, rapier, a lot of the people doing those weapons, I think at the same time, are interested in the history of that period and the warfare of that period. But ironically, most of what we practice in the classroom is not irrelevant. I wouldn't go as far as to say that. It is relevant. You need to learn how to use a sword unarmoured, regardless, but is actually of, shall we say, limited application on the medieval or Renaissance battlefield. Now, primarily what I want to consider are the types of weapons that are used. Now, everybody who's been watching my channel for the last few years since I started, I've always made a big thing about the fact that swords are secondary, sometimes even tertiary weapons. Sometimes they're not carried at all by someone. There are plenty of figures in medieval art who carry a primary weapon, which might be a polearm or a crossbow or bow or whatever, and they might not even have a sword. Some people, evidently, if we trust the medieval art, didn't actually necessarily see a sword as that important if you had other weapons. So if your primary role is as a pikeman or a billman or halberdier, a gunner, crossbowman, whatever, then actually a sword might not be very important to you at all. And those people, those soldiers on the medieval battlefield, were more important than swordsmen were. Now, inevitably, one of the reasons that we are so focused on swords is because so much attention is given to swords in the medieval treatises. And that is true. When we consider, actually, how massively important the medieval battlefield and medieval history pole weapons were, so spears, pole axes, halberds, bills, things like this, they're actually treated remarkably little in the treatises. Well, that tells us something straight off there, doesn't it? It tells us the treatises aren't really about training soldiers most of the time. They are almost fetishized studies of how to use the personal weapons of the gentry. And yes, in some cases, the knights were, the men-at-arms and the knights, the classes that these treatises were predominantly aimed at, were very important on the medieval battlefield in their time and in their place. But the majority of soldiers for the majority of history have been common men who have been not fully armoured and have been not armed with things like long swords, or indeed most of the time with things like poleaxes. So what are the polearms we're talking about here? Well, first of all, in different countries it varies. Okay, so in England, for example, was famous for the use of the bill, but we also know that spear was very predominant as well. In the first part of the 100 Years' War, it seems the spear was a pretty much universal primary weapon for infantry if they weren't using a longbow. So most of your people on foot would either have a longbow or a spear. End of. Okay, swords as a backup, yes, but they're not terribly important to the overall tactics of warfare of that time. If you go to Switzerland, they were famous for both pikes and halberds. The Germanic, so Germany, the German states, various different German states, parts of the Holy Roman Empire, in other words, Austria, northern Italy, quite well known for using halberds also. And if we go into northern Italy, then bills, a certain type of Italian bill, which is a different shape to an English bill in general, although in England we did also import Italian bills, certainly in the 15th century. You know, if we look at different countries, you find different tendencies. The glaive, for example, is particularly associated with the French, and the certain forms of what might be called fauchard or guisarme and things like this. So you find different tendencies of different pole weapons in different countries. That's an interesting thing, especially if you're doing living history or reenactment, if you want to portray mercenary Bavarian infantrymen, you're probably going to have a halberd. In the 15th century, for example. But at any one time, you wouldn't usually have a block of people armed with polearms who would have all the same polearm. Because whilst to some degree some of these polearms were mass manufactured in workshops, so a local lord might go, oh, I want to get some new weapons for my retinue, I'll order 50 halberds. And so all of those halberds might look similar. But within an army, not all the halberds would look similar, and not all the people would have halberds. So within an army, within a retinue, there might be some regularity, but within an army, you might have a mixture of, you know, halberds, bills, partisans, guisarmes, fauchards, all sorts of stuff. Okay, also, and pikes and spears and flails even, and this kind of stuff. And if we look at the medieval art, we do see this represented. Very often, infantry who are armed and arrayed with massed polearms, pole weapons, you do normally see a variety of pole weapons within a group. You don't normally see them all with one regulated type of pole weapon. So that's kind of interesting. And there's a lot to be said and researched and written about pole weapons. And I have to say, they don't get the love they deserve, because they were absolutely critical in medieval warfare. And yet there are countless tomes written about swords, which are backup weapons. How many books are written about medieval polearms? I think one that I know of in Italian, which is very hard to get hold of. So there needs to be more study done on pole weapons, definitely. And also, I have to say, if you're in the market for buying original antiques, if you want to buy an original medieval sword, then you're going to be looking in the several thousands for something in very poor condition. So you usually 5,000 to 10,000 starting price. Sword from Castillon, the River Dordogne, for example, you might be looking at 20 or 50,000 pounds. But you can buy probably an original medieval halberd or bill head for maybe under £1,000, maybe a few £100 if you're lucky, if you're in the right place at the right time. So, the other thing I want to talk about as well is, why were polearms so important? Well, on this channel I've spoken so much about the reach factor. Funnily enough, reach becomes less important as armour and shields come in. So in a battlefield context, indeed, if you take something like the Roman army, so people often go, oh, Romans have short swords. Yeah, they had Polearms as well. But yes, and they did have triarii, they did have spears as well. But yes, indeed, if you've got large shields and you've got armour, you can rely on shorter weapons, because that enables you to close the distance. But ironically, in the medieval context, this kind of stuff, armour, became so effective against weapons like this that by and large, yes, of course, you can overcome an armoured person with just a sword or just a dagger by sticking it in the right gap, or wrestling them to the ground or whatever, but by and large, you don't want to, this is a backup weapon, and this is fairly difficult. If someone's well armoured, if someone's wearing full harness, certainly, it is fairly difficult with a sword like a mesa or any type of sword really to wound someone or incapacitate someone who is wearing full armour. And of course, you know, remember that this stuff is designed to take lances breaking on it. So you can charge at someone on horseback and break a lance on them and still not injure them. Yes, of course, that's with a coronal and a blunt lance. It's not a lance of war, but nevertheless, this stuff works. As you've seen Todd's video and you've seen other videos, arrows will bounce off this. Even modern pistol rounds will bounce off breastplates and medieval helmets. 9mm won't get through most of this stuff. So, It's very, very strong stuff, and really it's about finding gaps or overcoming the person's body inside. So of course, if you're arming or equipping a retinue or an entire army with a principal weapon to overcome armoured opponents, and bear in mind, just because someone's not a knight or not a man-at-arms, even if they're fighting on foot and they're just a billman or a halberdier, they can be wearing quite a lot of armour in this period. They could be wearing a mail shirt over an arming doublet, and over that a brigandine or a breastplate with folds, sometimes some plate legs, sometimes plate arms, a helmet pretty much always, sometimes a bever as well. You can get common soldiers, billmen and halberdiers and stuff, who are basically wearing as much armour as a knight in this period, and certainly by the late 15th century. So they can be very, very heavily equipped and armoured. So if you're arming and equipping a retinue or an army to overcome these sorts of opponents, what sort of principal weapons are you going to give them? Well, you're going to give them the most powerful missile weapons you can lay your hands on. So guns, very heavy drawweight war bows, and we know that, well, at least all the evidence suggests that the power of bows went up and up in this period to try and deal with the armour. And making the arrows, not just the bows incidentally, but the arrows became more and more specialised, thicker, heavier to try and overcome armour. And crossbows, so that's your missile weapons. And for hand weapons, of course, well, polearms, because the polearm in striking against armoured opponents has every advantage. Not only does it have the reach advantage that antiquity pointed out when there was less armour in play, but of course, against armoured opponents, you've got a leverage and a weight advantage. So you can now use a large two-handed bill, strikes with, I don't know how many times more force than a longsword or a falchion ever will. You simply can't, with something that is of sword length, in other words, a lever of that long, you cannot strike with anything like the force that you can strike with a polearm with. So a weapon that's 6 feet or longer and heavier as well, and with the weight concentrated at the head end, strikes with so much more force than a sword. So in terms of striking, but in terms of thrusting as well. Points on swords, you can make a sword thicker and heavier, indeed, but generally speaking, a polearm, so I'll just put the helmet, oh actually I can keep the helmet, I'll pick up, this is a polearm head, which is useful because I'm in a study. The polearm can have a thicker and more robust point on it, whether it's the back spike or the end spike, than a sword can ever realistically have while still being a sword. Yes, indeed, you can make something like an estoc, concert, which is essentially like one of these square spikes, but it's at that point it starts to become almost a different thing than a sword. And of course, it's attached to a wooden shaft, and the wooden shaft doesn't flex as much as a steel blade will in general, so you'll get more energy transference and a more robust point on a polearm than you will do on a sword. And this on a long stick, this is easy to make, it's cheaper to make, quicker to make than a sword. This on a long stick will have an advantage against a swordsman pretty much all of the time, in armour or out of armour. It can thrust more strongly, it can strike more strongly, you've got greater leverage to defend yourself with. Against cavalry, of course, very, very important. If cavalry are going to be coming charging you down with lances, the longer your weapon, so you can reach the head of their horse and stab their horse at the same distance they're trying to stab you with their lance, or even you might even have longer reach if you've got something like a pike, then that's a good advantage. Even in very, very close in combat, the pole weapon is still, as you know, I've demonstrated in previous videos, very useful and effective pushing away. You can use the butt end, this kind of stuff. And of course, you can form units of people with pole weapons that form a bit like a giant porcupine, which is less easy to do with swords because they are shorter, and certainly cutting swords require some space to swing either side, whereas if you're lopping something that's on the end of a long stick, then the weapon's further away from the people, and it's easier to use in a group. So, to summarise, the thing which has really struck home with me is how we fixate so much on swords. I mean, the number of videos I've made on this channel on swords, the number of people studying HEMA who really only focus on sword, they maybe pick up a pole weapon a few times a year, maybe no times a year. Maybe they occasionally do dagger, you know, that's fine. It's all about fun at the end of the day, and that's fine, but we should also remind ourselves that if we're really thinking about medieval and Renaissance warfare, the pole weapon, in military terms, is vastly, vastly more important than the sword ever was, and Armour made it even more so. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again soon for another video on Schola Gladiatori channel, and video suggestions always welcome. I've got a list of videos to get through, but I'm always looking for new suggestions, new ideas, or even appendices or variations of videos I've made in the past where you want me to concentrate on one specific point or expand on one specific point, or add something to a subject which I didn't mention previously. Thanks a lot for watching. Please give us a subscribe and a like, share the video, and I'll see you again really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.